You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender-questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender-questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens.
Bret Alderman is a writer and life coach who works with gender-questioning teens and their parents. He received his PhD in depth psychology from the Pacifica Graduate Institute in 2012. His book, Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language, a Jungian interpretation of the linguistic turn, is an attempt to understand postmodernism and specifically its intense preoccupation with language from the perspective informed by the work of Carl Jung. This work, in turn, has led him to an interest in queer theory and its relationship to earlier first-generation postmodernist thinkers. Bret's insights into postmodernism and post-structuralist thinking provides a really rich platform for us today, where we try to get a grip with gender ideology. In this fascinating conversation, he explains this linguistic turn and other Jungian concepts like ideological possessions and the archetypes. Perhaps most importantly, Bret tells us why a statement can be literally false and yet remain metaphorically true, and how we can best respond when this is happening. Here's our conversation with Bret Alderman. Welcome to the show, Bret. We're really glad to have you here.
I was delighted to be invited. I am going to be among a list of really, really impressive guests, which feels great.
Oh. You also are an impressive guest. So there's a lot that we wanted to cover with you today, but maybe we could start with you sharing a little bit about your book. It's called Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language. And essentially, this is a book about postmodernism and post-structuralism and how that interacts with a lot of theorists that have come up, I believe, from the 90s on. Is that correct?
I would say even before that, the late 60s on.
Okay. Tell us about it.
So I was looking at something that's called the Linguistic Turn, which, broadly speaking, is a movement in 20th century philosophy and social sciences in which people really start to look at language in a new way and start to try to just kind of dissect language in an attempt to answer certain philosophical questions. But one of the things that really happened in that movement is people started to kind of shift their understanding on what language does and how it works. Before the linguistic turn, we had this idea that language was an attempt to represent something that was already there. So, I see the light coming through the window, and I say the words, I see the light coming through the window, and it's an attempt to present again some original perception that I've had. Then the linguistic turn comes around, and it kind of flips that whole script on its head and says, actually, it seems like it's the language that comes first and then the perception. So it seems to be that language is actually constructing what you think is actually there to begin with. This becomes really, really important later on when we start thinking about this in terms of gender and queer theory, which was very, very influenced by deconstruction, post-structuralism, and the linguistic turn more broadly.
Mm-hmm. I think language always has an implication. Well, not always. Let me say certain types of language holds an implication within it, right? So, we could get really granular here, but of course, adjectives are meant to convey almost an opinion sometimes. Okay. Sometimes they're objective, but sometimes they're not. So where do you think they went wrong? Because I could see how the way we talk about something and describe it can impact our perceptions of it. Like, sure, that seems true, but it's gotten tipped into an area that is so esoteric that is, I think, not helpful anymore. Where do you think that line is?
I think This is a good moment to bring in an idea of Jung's, which is the nothing but attitude. And it's this sort of reductive attitude that wants to take one element or one key idea and reduce everything else to that one idea. So, for example, as regards language and this idea of construction. Now, it's one thing to acknowledge what you just acknowledged, that, yeah, language does have its say, and it does, to a degree, determine what we're perceiving. I think that to me seems like a pretty sound observation. But I think where things go wrong is when we say it's nothing but that. It's purely the language that's determining the perception. The perception has no say. The phenomena itself has no say. Nature or objectivity or anything that you might consider to be other than construction is just sort of swept under the rug. So I mean, that's really it.
Is there an example that you can use to kind of ground us? Like, how might a theorist imply that language is the only thing constructing perception and reality? What's an example that like a famous postmodernist or post-constructionist would have used?
Well, I'm tempted to go straight to the heart of the matter and start talking about gender and the gender binary. There's this idea that the male-female binary is just that, just a construct, just this sort of some legacy granted us by cis heteronormative patriarchy or what have you. So there's no sense in which actually that binary, male-female, is a result of this thing that all of us can perceive, this basic fact that human beings basically come in two primary categories. There's male and there's female. We can all see it. We've been using these distinctions for years because it's something not only that the science of biology has taught us, but something that we just perceive every day. But when the conception is understood to precede the perception, then the perception gets swept under the rug, and it's actually the binary that's believed to be just an arbitrary something that we've been granted by this by history.
So, do you see that this gender phenomenon that we have now is very much kind of a reflection on this post-structuralism, postmodernist thinking? Like, which came first, I'm wondering?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, like queer theory and gender identity theory, as we know it, would be impossible without deconstruction and post-structuralism and the particular understanding of language that it inaugurated. However, as much as I'm tempted to say that a gender identity theory has arisen because of that, I mean, really, there's got to be something even before that. I mean, what was going on in the culture? I think we were already becoming somewhat disembodied innate for the linguistic turn and all these new ideas to even take root. So those ideas are symptomatic of something else happening in the broader psyche. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It's like we were kind of, maybe with technology and leaving behind, I'm getting a bit loquacious now, but leaving behind the land, that we've become more and more disconnected with the body, with nature, and more just literally we are minds. We're just all about what's going on inside our brains and nothing else.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the metaphors that I used in my book to describe this is that of the astronaut. It's like we're becoming astronauts and we're floating outside the Earth, and we see the Earth down there, and the Earth itself almost seems like just one random planet floating in space, and almost like we could leave it behind entirely. And we've kind of lost the idea that actually that's where we come from, and we couldn't even be looking at the Earth from space if it weren't for the fact that we started in the Earth itself. So, it's very disembodied. And, I think that image of being outside the Earth is also a great image for talking about being distanced from nature. And nature is one of those ideas that deconstruction and queer theory also really like to glom onto. And say, there is no nature. There is no nature. We have to denaturalize certain concepts. There are certain concepts that we take for granted. And every time something like queer theory sees that, it says, okay, we've got to show that actually that's not just a natural thing to think or believe. That's culturally constructed. It's inherited. And it's often thought of as being inherited by way of a history of oppression. And, I see you nodding your head.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm thinking about what happens, at least for a lot of gender questioning kids. And parents find this really confusing because, of course, the parent's story is like, my kid has never, ever questioned their gender. They were very gender typical. And even if they were somewhat gender nonconforming, they were never distressed. They found a comfortable way to just be themselves. And so when kids come to the parents with these new ideas, parents are very, very confused. And what I end up discovering through working with young people is that what happens first is that the kid, usually the trajectory is like they get a cell phone, okay, for the first time around 11 or 12. And they stumble into these kind of postmodern beliefs around gender. And the kid thinks, oh my God, I was sheltered from all this knowledge, quote unquote, about how the world really works. And I've discovered through this education that actually all of the gender roles that I've been participating in were imposed onto me by a cis heteronormative society. And I've been slowly geared or kind of coerced into being this cis heteronormative person, but really I now can see, my eyes have been opened, I'm enlightened, and I see through. Yeah. And it's almost conspiratorial insofar as the belief is that everything in your world is pushing you towards cis heteronormativity. But really, if you had the true blank slateness of your nature, you could have been a million things and you could have done a million things. So then parents are like, I don't get it. You've never been gender nonconforming. And the kid has an answer for that. It's like, well, I wasn't allowed to be because of our society or whatever. So I'm thinking about how this plays out in the mind of a young person who's very intelligent and cerebral, but maybe not maturationally sophisticated. And so they don't know how to tease apart this stuff. It's like this eye-opening belief system, supposedly, to the child that doesn't actually have a lot of grounding in reality. And it also takes for granted how malleable we are. Ironically, because they're saying we've all been molded to be a certain way, which is heteronormative. But actually, these young people are so malleable to this entire belief system.
It's a really powerful narrative. It's sort of enticing, for me to think that I've been sort of duped my whole life and oppressed. And then all of a sudden, I have this way of thinking of things that allows me to move beyond that. It sets up sort of a heroic narrative and a heroic sort of resistance against the evil Beelzebub or demonic figure of the cis heteronormative patriarchal culture. And that's, we all need, this is what I keep coming back to. We need those sorts of stories. For me, those are exactly the type of stories that are called archetypal, and they keep coming up millennia after millennia. We keep seeing what are essentially really similar narratives. So I don't want to give up on those narratives. What I want to do is to just highlight them, see that they're in play, and try to tease apart How are they in play? And is this real in the same sense that we think they're real? Or are they metaphors that are kind of playing themselves out that actually represent something completely different? I mean, let's really tease apart these narratives and see what's actually going on there.
There's something in the adolescent development like there's something about being a teen where you're supposed to feel as though now you're entering the world of adult knowledge and the innocence of childhood is behind you. And you touched on kind of initiation rites and that important story of kind of the death of the child in order to be reborn as an adult, and that initiation into like the difficult world of adult knowledge and adult ideas is part of that too, right?
It's a huge part of it. I see a lot of death rebirth motif running throughout the whole discourse on what it means to be transgender. I mean, you've got the idea of a dead name, right? People are always taking these new names. Look, at that basic practice has been around for centuries. This is commonplace in many cultures. You know, a boy reaches 12 years old, he goes through some excruciatingly painful initiation ceremony. He's given a new name, and everyone around it is told, don't use the old name. This is a new person. Something similar happens with women too. So that says to me that this is part of a necessary process. And also, which I think is important for therapists and anyone who works with transgender youth to understand, okay, there's something going on here that actually does need to happen, but it might need to be given a different framework, a different understanding. There is a sense in which the old person's dying and a new person is coming into being. But you know, there's a lot to tease apart in that question of, well, in what sense is this a new person?
We've lost so much, and we knew it at the time. We knew we were losing a lot when we were losing all the ceremonies, you know, the just from religion. Now that we're living in this post-religious age, and all those rites that were thousands of years old and had so much depth and power to them, and we've lost them. And we knew, so many commentators commented on what will happen, you know, how will we function without it? And it seems to have come to pass that no, the children needed some sort of recognition of going. For example, I'm Irish Catholic. At 7, you had your communion. And that was moving from baby, you know, young child to middle child. And then at 12, you had your confirmation. These were huge events. Up until about 20 years ago, they were massive, like absolutely massive in every Irish Catholic child's life. And suddenly they were gone. And we have filled that vacuum, it feels.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I think of here in the United States for girls, you know, a quinceañera for Latinas, or, you know, we have bar mitzvahs too for Jewish people, Jewish boys. But, you know, I think a lot of the symbolic resonance and importance of even those ceremonies has been really lost. You know, it's kind of like when Christians put up a Christmas tree, we don't really think of it symbolically. It's kind of lost any meaning. It's just sort of perfunctory thing you do.
And it's money, it's consumerism. There's a lot of, like, nowadays they still have the communion and the confirmation, but all the serious gravity, all the feeling of, oh, I remember making my communion and we had to have a first confession first, and it was so serious. I was so schooled for my confession. And then, you know, it was like you were achieving it, you know what I mean? And then you reached it. Yeah. And then the same for the confirmation, it was serious. It was a challenge that you were going to do. And now it's just a few quid and you're going to have a party in a bouncy castle. It's nothing. It's a consumerist kind of shallow, vacuous affair.
Yeah, it's lost its significance.
And I mean, I've noticed, Stella, you and I keep coming back to this, like, it sounds so dark in a way, but this need to suffer to kind of cross the threshold from one life stage to the other. And there is this kind of beautiful, glorious suffering that angsty teenagers experience, you know? And I remember watching this show, My So-Called Life, when I was a teenager. And it was a show about a bunch of like depressed teenagers, but I was so enamored by it. And I think about this move from innocence to like the dark truth of the world. And I think for sometimes it seems to a young person like transition is going to be that suffering, and then they're going to emerge on the other side transformed.
Yeah. Sure.
And then there's also the detransitioners who they were kind of, what they describe in hindsight is, I was living in a fantasy world. It was a childlike fantasy that I would go through this process and it would solve all my problems. And it's actually the detransition that becomes the initiatory process of like, now I have been really schooled in the real way things work. For example, the fact that sometimes the medical industry takes advantage of people or isn't as safe as it proclaims to be. And like all of these dark, really ugly truths about the world, like your trust in how smooth everything will be disappears. So it's interesting how like initiation is showing up at so many different parts of that process.
Right. You know, I guess that's why I want to continue to shed more light on that fact, because it's going to show up. You know, the question is whether or not you're going to be consciously initiated or if you're just going to be kind of dragged along in the process.
When did you first notice that gender had kind of arrived in a post-structuralist way? Or were you on it anyway?
Well, you know, that's a really good question because, you know, in my first book, I actually cite Judith Butler, and this is before I really know who Judith Butler is, and I kind of cite her to you know, put forth my own argument. And then later on, I realize, oh, wow, she is who she is. Okay, well, this is interesting.
That's really funny.
And it didn't actually lessen my argument. In fact, it might have shown that I am willing to cite people that I don't agree with on everything. But she had some interesting insights into Michel Foucault that I thought were spot on, you know. But I think it was within the last few years. I mean, I remember being at, you know, different events and hearing people use the term gender assigned at birth. And as soon as I heard assigned, I thought, okay, there it is. They're switching from discovered or observed to assigned. That's the basic switch that, you know, deconstruction and post-structuralism make in its most simplest form. And then I think like for a lot of people, it was with the pandemic and like being on Twitter a lot more, and then just seeing that I began to see gender as being sort of the locus of a huge cultural complex that we're trying to wrestle with and figure out. It seemed like kind of gender seems to be like the epicenter of some broader psychological cultural complex that we're trying to work through. And it ain't easy, apparently.
Wow.
You mentioned, as we were kind of discussing the episode, something that could be literally false and metaphorically true.
Right.
Can you flesh that out a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, in the context of gender, if I were to tell you two right now that I'm a woman, I mean, that's a statement that's literally false. And all of us know this. But that could be metaphorically true in the sense that, you know, what do I mean if I say I'm a woman? Do I mean that I have certain qualities that I associate with the word woman? You know, the statement I am a woman is false at the level of what the word woman denotes, but we have all these connotations that sort of surround the word woman. You know, some people might think of woman and they might hear or think something like, gentle, intuitive, emotional, delicate, you know, things like that. I'm not saying that these are the right associations, but people have those associations. And so if I feel that I have all those qualities too, it might express itself in the idea that, oh, well, I'm a woman. So there you can see the kind of the confusion and conflation between both the literal meaning and the metaphorical meaning, and also what the word means, the word woman means at the level of denotation and connotation. And all of this are like binaries that queer theory and deconstruction like to pull apart. They like, and not only pull them apart, but change what comes first. So that they're always, Judith Butler does this a lot in, for example, her book, Bodies That Matter, where she actually puts forth the idea that, well, actually it's gender that comes first, and then sex is kind of a result of gender. Whereas most people think, well, that's absolutely, utterly impossible. Well, because it is, but usually we think of, well, there's this thing called biological sex, and then gender is sort of this like cultural elaboration of it. It's this kind of set of, ideas and practices that, that we associate with women, but it's sort of, it's a cultural thing that comes after the fact of this biological fact of sex, right? But, Butler switches that. She puts the cart before the horse, if you want to put it that way.
You know what? I'm really glad you're saying all this, because really up until this conversation and gender assigned at birth and phrases like that, I had a more paranoid or conspiratorial kind of view of where those phrases came from, as if, people were, pushing them in because they had an end game in mind, which was basically everybody should transition, or certainly a very strong push. Not everybody, you know what I mean? But that's where it was coming from. But now that you're speaking, I'm realizing, which I should have known a long time ago, was actually, no, these are people who've wrapped themselves up in all sorts of thoughts around deconstructionism, queer theory, and they're just playing really with words and thoughts. And frankly, honestly, the more I read about queer theory, I think, how did they move into surgery? How did they get into a physical thing when it's so based in language? Queer theory just seems so not where the kind of the hormonal interventions, the surgical interventions. I'm so surprised it ended up there, if you follow me. But I'm really glad you raised all that. Yeah.
I'm surprised too. But I'm like in the process of trying to think that one through. But Judith Butler has this book, Bodies That Matter, where she really tries to focus on this idea of matter and what it is. And she has this really clever way of describing how we used to think of matter as this sort of, having this sort of like ontic reality. It was just something that was there. And she comes in and says, well, actually, no, it's so utterly entwined with language itself that we can't say what comes first. And so it's almost just in that confusion and conflation that she makes this sort of medicalization possible, the literalization of metaphor, the idea that it's as if the physical body becomes like a sign, like it becomes reduced to semiotics itself.
Wow.
So that my body has to communicate to you who I am. The body is language itself. If I have breasts, that's signifying something to you.
That's right. And when you listen to, for example, the kind of debates around like trans women in sports, for example, the advocates for trans women's inclusion, they start to atomize humans into these characteristics. So like there's maleness is the presence of more body hair and the lack of breasts or something. And so rather than saying, oh, well, those all happen to be characteristics of male-bodied people, they flip it around and they take the characteristics first, and then they say those indicate masculinity. And so then when you're talking about this with the hormones and surgery, then we all become like a Mr. Potato Head, where you literally can just impose those characteristics onto any body, literally body, and that becomes a body that signals masculinity or signals femininity. And that's all that matters, because there was never an essential or kind of like solidifying original state of maleness and femaleness. It was always just the characteristics, apparently.
And it's really scary to see how this logic is playing out in terms of things like designer genders, and you go onto some websites where they're doing these surgeries where, a person comes in and says, I want to be, neither male nor female. I want to, have a little bit of both, or I want to completely nullify it all, which says so much what that person is suffering through, that they want to nullify something that's so essential to their being. Frightening.
It really is.
Oh, it's so dark.
It reminds me really of what my dad used to say about certain people, not me, that they're so clever, they're stupid. And it's like, it feels like they've wrapped themselves, into thought, and they've left behind any level of sense. How does all of this apply to animals? How does all of this apply to animals? How does any of this sort of theory apply to animals?
It doesn't really.
But the theorists, the Judith Butlers, what do they think? Do they just say this is purely the human experience, leaves behind the fact that we're bodies at all, really, nearly, that we're not animals and we're all in our mind? Is that it? Or
that's a good question. I don't know. To be honest, I haven't read queer theory that addresses the question of animals. But I think it's always, and maybe that's because that's what they can't address, and the fact that, animals who are sexually dimorphic also exhibit differences in behavior, which might be analogous to different genders. They act differently. It's not just an anatomical difference, it's a behavioral difference. Which I think is a lot of what gender is trying to get at. There are just behavioral, natural differences that, granted, they have a particular cultural manifestation. They're not showing up in the same way all the time in all cultures. But even there, we can see certain similarities. It's not completely arbitrary, no matter what people would like to say.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high-quality content for this show, and we're grateful to Rhyme and GenSpect for supporting us.
Rhyme, or Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics, is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And GenSpect is an international alliance of parents and professional groups whose aim is to advocate for parents of gender-questioning children and young people.
If you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts and special Q&As, and you can join our listener community.
Now back to the show. I'd like to take a stab at your question there, Stella, because I've asked this question or questions along these lines to clients or to people who are really wrapped up with this. And I've thought about it because I used to think, well, this is the key. If you can just kind of demonstrate that animals don't have to deal with these things, and you remind people that we're mammals, then all of this will be a lot easier. But that's, of course, not the way it works. But I think what people might say is, but we have culture, unlike animals, where we have a set of rules and expectations and rituals and traditions which dictate how male-assigned people and female-assigned people are molded to live. And so if we could free ourselves, so this is, I think, where these constructionists might agree with like a certain type of feminist perspective too, right? Like we're all blank slates, actually. And if we didn't have culture, and if we can rearrange culture, then this doesn't really become a problem anymore. So I think what you're saying, Bret, is maybe your perspective, and I would say my perspective is the cultural norms that we have are at least in part influenced by biological truths. Not completely, but at least in part. And so we can't really separate the nature question from the environment question, I think.
Right. Absolutely. And as you're saying that, I'm reminded of one of the mythic figures that I use to describe what you just articulated. I talk a lot about Prometheus. Now, Prometheus is the Greek titan who, steals fire from the gods, gives it to humanity so that humanity can create culture and liberate itself from being just another animal. So there's this idea that Prometheus grants humans the ability of self-determination, we liberate ourselves from nature, and we also liberate ourselves from the gods, sort of those tyrannical figures. And so, there's a lot of Prometheanism, I think, in kind of the gender fantasy. And Prometheus is, by the way, the kind of the patron saint of technology, because he's supposedly who's given it to us.
Oh.
And, what is medicalization and transgenderism, if not a Promethean fantasy that we can simply create ourselves in whatever image we want, that we are, in fact, the gods who get to determine everything. And, Prometheus has a really gruesome fate. He gets tied to a rock and has an eagle eat out his liver for several millennia. He's just, perpetual suffering for the hubris of thinking that, he can defy
oh my God,
both nature and the gods. And I'm putting the gods in scare quotes so that people know I'm not putting forth a theology here.
And yet this feels like a very good argument that this gender ideology is religious, because it feels like it centers the human as this special being, a special being who can do all sorts of things that animals can't do, and that can do all sorts of kind of changes that animals can't do, because we're special, we are sacred, we are human. That seems to be the central premise here.
I think you're spot on. I'm trying lately to not say religious, but say it's like a religious fundamentalism, because I don't know, for me particularly, I want to kind of differentiate those two, because I think there are a lot of religious people who gain a lot from religion, and I think there's something in the religious ethos and in the stories that we need to hold on to. It's when it becomes kind of a fundamentalism or a dogma that's unshakable. And isn't that what a lot of us are seeing? I mean, it's not just that the ideas in a lot of gender identity theory are things that we don't agree with. It's that when we disagree, oh my gosh, the blowback.
It's like Prometheus.
It's something that's become indisputable. Absolutely indisputable.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you thought about why? I know it's a dogma, and people don't like heretics. But have you any kind of post-structuralist theory about why the pushback on anybody who doesn't believe is so intense? I have my own theories, but do you have any within your kind of field?
Well, Jung, he talked a lot about ideological possession. And for him, ideological possession was basically, it was something like the modern form of religious possession. So he looked at kind of the language of religion and how, people in the past would talk about someone being possessed by the devil. And they would need to, have an exorcism. Or they'd say that someone was possessed of the Holy Ghost. And there was a lot of, talk about just, there being these certain spirits that could inhabit us and make us act in particular ways, right? And so he kind of looked at that language, then he looked at the world around him. Keep in mind, he lived through the 1940s and World War II, and he was a German-speaking Swiss man, and so he saw the insanity that the German-speaking world was going through, and saw Nazism, saw communism, and saw, in effect, kind of the same sort of structure. It's like, okay, now before we were being possessed by quote unquote gods, now we're being possessed by ideologies, but it's essentially the same. It's the same thing. The gods have changed their names, but now they've become ideas. So that's that. I mean, there's one aspect, and there, I've kind of focused on like three different things that for me seem really relevant when you deify an idea, when a particular idea becomes, your focus and your fascination. One is that the idea becomes invested with a numinous emotion. Now, numinous was a word that Jung got from Rudolf Otto, who was a historian of religion. And Otto coined that term to speak of these particular emotions that are often associated with religious experiences. They can be positive or negative. They can be bliss, ecstasy, excitement, but they can also be horror, shame, panic. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times the ideas, they get invested with this sort of supercharged emotion, right? Another thing that seems to characterize ideological possession is this nothing but attitude, which I kind of briefly alluded to before. That is to say that everything gets reduced to this one idea. So it can be gender, it can be race, it can be heteronormativity, but somehow there's this reigning principle that is used to explain everything, right? It's kind of like, and it becomes kind of like how a lot of people might define God as being everywhere yet nowhere in particular. Now that's a common way of understanding the Godhead or God in many different traditions, right? So when you have like this central idea that you're sort of obsessed with, it kind of functions in the same way. We've all met these people who they're always coming back to one thing. Maybe for Freud, it was like, it's all about sex all the time, 24/7. And for Ibram X. Kendi, it's all about race all the time. There's no other way of explaining any inequity whatsoever. Or for Judith Butler, it might be, heteronormativity, which is also used to explain anything or everything all the time. And it's also something you can't quite point to it. It's not like an object sitting on your table and you can say that's heteronormativity right there. It's diffuse. We can see evidence of it, but we can't really say where it's at. It's hard to pin down, right?
Yeah. I think about, I used to be much more persuaded by a lot of a certain type of radical feminist views. And I remember watching a feminist named Gail Dines, who's done some, I think, really important work around the impact of pornography. So I still agree with a lot of her views, but I remember her talking about either the patriarchy or sexism or something. And she said, we are so inundated with it. It's invisible. It's like the air we breathe. And at the time when I was really imbibing these views, I did develop a kind of paranoia, I have to say, about this invisible sexism or patriarchy that could be around every corner and actually is around every single corner, in every interaction. You can barely tell when it's happening. It's like the air you breathe. And I've heard you talk about even how certain ideas around, quote, anti-racism are like that racism is everywhere all the time. And you can barely even register that it's happening because we're so inundated with it. So that's so much like this omnipotence. Like I grew up in a Coptic Orthodox family, and I always got in trouble in Sunday school for asking these really difficult questions. And I was a little bit of a contrarian, but I remember when I was taught that God is everywhere and can see you all the time, it was terrifying.
Yeah.
Like we get no privacy ever. God's just watching me all the time.
And
he's not a comforting feeling.
He has counted every grain of sand. It's like every grain of sand. Every grain of sand. What the heck?
Every hair on your head or whatever. Like,
The concept, and that he was looking at me while he was looking at Sasha, and he was looking at people thousands of years ago, and he's looking at people in the future. it's mind bending, and it's incredibly similar.
Yes.
That it makes you paranoid.
Yeah.
And it makes you special as well, though.
Right. I'm wondering, is there a third thing during this ideological possession? Because we talked about the numinous emotion and the nothing but attitude. Is there a third, or did we wrap up all three?
No, but we've kind of already talked a little bit about the third. That's the literalization of metaphor, or the confusion of like metaphorical and literal understandings.
Wow.
Which, again, I think is so important when thinking about gender. When I'm speaking with a trans-identified person, especially a young person, I don't want to come at them with this just with the acknowledgement that what they're saying is literally false. That might be a completely appropriate attitude in a political context when we're talking about legislation. But I think when you're working with someone and trying to, help them understand themselves, it's really good to have that understanding of the metaphorical significance of certain statements, which is super important. And so I do like to be able to say, okay, well, in what sense are you a woman? Or what does that mean to you? And really take it seriously, because it gets people thinking and really thinking through their own personalities and their own dynamics, and it gets it beyond dogma.
Yeah.
One of the things that I haven't mentioned is, we already spoke about the deification of a particular idea, but that comes with the fact that there's often no countervailing principle to that idea. So it's like, for example, in social construction, people are talking about how everything is just constructed, right? And there's some truth to that. But the problem, that's not the problem. The problem is that sometimes the countervailing principle of a biological reality is absent, or a countervailing principle of an objective reality, or something that will allow us to say, well, social construction, that's an element of a really complex situation. And that's what we're talking about. When we talk about ideological possession, we're talking about a complex. And, how do you work with a complex? Well, you continue to look at its complexity. You see it from multiple perspectives. You kind of suss out the ideas. You address it not in a simplistic way, but in a really complex, thorough, thoughtful way. You meditate on it.
I want to kind of keep asking you about the way you might work with a young person, because you are a life coach, and so I think you probably work with some young people who are questioning their gender. And what I find is that, at least at the beginning of the therapy process, when you attempt to dig deeper into the metaphor, let's say you're talking to a young person, you say, explain to me what that means to you to have a woman inside, let's say, you're using that language. I find that a lot of young people are not able to articulate anything beyond the kind of scripts they read on the internet.
Absolutely.
For lack of, I know that sounds really reductive. These are not unintelligent kids, but they've immersed themselves in this highly cerebral, jargony kind of narrative for so long that they're just, it seems to me at the beginning at least, they're just regurgitating things they've read before. I wonder if that's your experience, and how do you move past that into a deeper place?
I've found the same thing, and I'm having to learn as I go, because I'll ask questions and I'll get these responses that are 10 seconds long, and there's just another response that I've heard from other people. And so I have to continually prod and ask more questions and try to make them as open-ended as possible so that I don't get a yes or no. And oftentimes I'll say things like, look at me, I'm this straight cis dude, like, explain to me what that's like, because I really don't know. I haven't experienced what you have. So, what's it like? What was it like yesterday? Ask for specifics. Are there specific times when you really, really felt this incongruence? Like, what was that like? Is it stronger at school than it is at home? Is it stronger when people are looking at you? Do you experience it when you're alone? Do you experience it when you're alone looking at yourself in the mirror?
That's great.
Or I'll bring in things like from my own childhood. It's like, you always have to judge whether or not you're sharing too much or too little. What? But I'll say, I used to wear a brooch to school and have my hair kind of orange, and I bought a dress, but I wore it as a trench coat, and I was like a gender bender. It's like, and just share that, just broaden the discussion, and but so much depends. I mean, there's like this really, really strong pushback, like, don't touch me, like, don't. I mean, there's like, and then other times it's, you can get a lot out of someone if you just keep talking to them, keep asking questions.
But that's very like, in my experience, that's very like, as a kid, you were told, and I was told many times, like, don't think like that, because, honestly, the devil will get in your mind there, and it will bring you to all sorts of places, if you follow me. So you can't, like, don't meet the devil halfway. You can't go down those roads. And that's very the same. I think an awful lot of children or teenage kids, they've been kind of indoctrinated. Don't think like that, because that's just your inner transphobia coming out, and it'll get you. It'll get you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, one of the things that I've done with that is, when someone talks to me about internalized transphobia, is I start to like talk about that as, okay, well, that's kind of like a voice in your head, right? And, I'll confess, well, I have voices in my head too. I mean, I have thoughts that kind of come to me, and I don't really agree with them, but I'm having them. So what is that? And so I start talking about techniques like what Jung called active imagination, where you just decide to have a dialogue with yourself, like two different aspects of yourself. And like, okay, what does this transphobic voice say? How can you respond to it? Well, then how does it respond when after you've just said that, and like get a dialogue going? And then it's important to really say that, you're agnostic about what happens in that dialogue, because it's important that the dialogue between these two parts of the person really be authentically theirs. And I just,
I really like that. And when I encounter that, I try to say, a principle in my therapy work is that all your thoughts and feelings are allowed here.
Yeah.
If you have a thought that pops up, let's not rush to label it. Let's just be curious about it. And it can't hurt you, like whatever we think and feel is a natural part of who you are. And I also, I keep thinking about your discussion of literal versus true, metaphorically true versus literally true. And, we talked about the metaphor of what it might mean to, let's say, to say to somebody that you're a woman. But I'm also thinking about this other metaphor that when you talked about what the transphobia sounds like or what the dysphoria feels like, I think sometimes these words offer a stand-in for other things. So, for example, the dysphoria sometimes, in my experience, is like, actually, that's being embarrassed and mortified, right? Like, or being really tired and stressed. Sometimes they call that dysphoria. And when you really unpick it and ask a lot of questions about it, as the clinician with a hypothesis, you think, oh, she's talking about when she feels left out and everyone's staring at her and she's embarrassed.
Lonely.
And so, and sometimes I think the metaphor is, I'm not who you think I am.
Exactly. I was thinking that as you said it. Wow. I will define myself. I am not who I've been told I am. And that's another place where people can really, a therapist or a coach should be able to really perceive and even encourage that, because we do all need to say, look, I'm not who you told me I am, because that's true. I mean, all of us have been misdefined and given labels that aren't appropriate. And it's a huge part of adolescence just saying, I'm not who you said I was. I am my own person. And it's also something that for parents to keep in mind, that their kids aren't exactly who they thought they were, and they shouldn't be. And children have every right to say, no, I don't agree with who you think I am. And the more you allow that, then I think the more kind of aberrant, crazy forms of self-definition kind of they get sloughed off, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we ran a parenting retreat recently, Stella and I and Lisa Marciano, and like one of the things we talked about is just that it's very normal for teenagers to radically change the way they present themselves to the world. And a lot of times, you know, there's a variety of different types of ROGD kids. I know there's become this kind of archetype, but really it's a huge variety. And sometimes parents will say, my kid was happy. Everybody like loves her. She was an upbeat, positive kid. I never thought I'd worry about her. And then she kind of just went dark. I mean, in addition to the gender thing, this is a kid who's depressed, like hiding in oversized clothing, sometimes self-harming. And I think, you know, there's something about that teenage period of time where you're saying, I am not the innocent, happy person you thought I was. I have dark thoughts too. I can have an existential crisis here. And I don't want to just be the perfect, happy kid that I was 5 years ago. Like there's something really important about going through the process. And I think, Bret, you're so right. Like if parents can acknowledge and make space for some of the darker, confusing, scary aspects of teenagehood, maybe the kids won't have to go as dark and as extreme.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So your knowledge and study of language and then Jungian analysis, does that clue us in about what do you think is going to happen with all this? Like we've radically changed the language around these ideas. Does studying Jung and the historical context of his work, does it give us any clues as to what might happen?
Could I add a question onto that same question? Because I was kind of circling the same point. Like you've studied, let's say, post-structuralism, and you've studied the deconstruction of everything here. And I'm wondering, so is there a new movement coming up? Is there new movements coming up, like backlashes to all this, or are we still right in the middle of this movement as such?
Sure. There are new.
Yeah, this is a very godlike predictability. You're omnipotent now, Bret. You tell us what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, throw me a couple softballs, guys. I mean, come on. You know, I'll address Sasha's and then Stella's question. This makes me think a lot of what Jungians would call the archetype of the apocalypse. Now, the apocalypse, from one perspective, is the end of everything, right? But let's keep in mind that apocalypse can have a metaphorical, or let's say another type of significance. So, in a sense, it might be that there's a whole worldview and set of assumptions that are coming to an end or being called into question. But the word apocalypse also means revelation. So it can be the revelation of something new that's coming, right? We're kind of back in the same death rebirth imagery, but maybe at a broader cultural level. So, I mean, I think for me, it's pretty clear that, you know, the gender identity theory and queer theory, it's not sustainable. I mean, there's just too many internal contradictions. I don't think it's sustainable. And if it were to sustain itself, it would only sustain itself through us like coming to an end. I mean, it's just like, it just doesn't work, right? So there's that. And, you know, what is going to be born out of the ashes? I don't know, but I'm a fan of what's called eco-psychology, and I really like, for example, looking at things through an evolutionary lens. And I think there is some pushback to some of this thinking from that area, right? Where people are looking at humans as animals and acknowledging that animals have have psyches. If anything has a psyche, if we have psyches, animals have psyches, and there are a lot of similarities. And there's a whole approach that's kind of bringing us back to nature, to the ground, to an evolutionary perspective. I think that's super useful and helpful. And, in some way we have to acknowledge that we're just animals, and we're not like Homo linguisticus. We're not just like a set of linguistic propositions. We're like these, physical bodies. And
speak for yourself, Bret.
Yeah.
I really like that. When Sasha asked you,
that's amazing.
When Sasha asked you earlier about an example of post-structuralism, and then later on, while we had this fascinating conversation, you said gender assigned at birth. Is that kind of lit a fire in you when you first heard it? Is that a very good example of post-structuralist thought? Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm kind of understanding you.
I think it's definitely it's like an echo of that.
Mm-hmm.
Just because there's the flip, the way they flip the script on language is it's not reflecting that something that's pre-existing. Language is something that you assign to that, right? It's like, I don't know, maybe take something like color. Now, in different languages, they have different words for colors, right? And so there's a sense in which actually we are attributing to the world a set of categories that aren't exactly there. Now, from another perspective, they certainly are there, because we can all distinguish, we can make the same distinctions, but we certainly call them different things.
You're so right. That's a perfect example. I had never thought about it that way. You're so right.
Very interesting.
Especially because colors are gradient and they can exist on a spectrum, and like reddish orange versus like yellowish orange are slightly different, just like how intersex people, it's so used by the theorists in a similar way. That's an amazing example.
And if you know more than one language, that, you do really enter into a different mindset. Yeah. And when you get really fluent in another language, you start to perceive things differently. And that people do kind of divvy up the world differently. They have different distinctions that they focus on. So that's kind of that's an argument for this sort of understanding of language as construct. But you also know that, we can translate languages, right? So we can get something of the sense that transfers from one to another. The differences aren't absolute. And people who know English can also learn Chinese and vice versa. And
translations actually work very well. Yeah. So that it does work as a concept. Yeah. Just before we finish,
but not always. It's interesting because it's not 100%.
Yeah,
it's so interesting.
Yeah. Just before we finish, you're a doctor of psychology, I think, and you're a life coach. And I've always wanted to ask you, as we're Twitter mutuals, you're like the thinking man's life coach. And did you make a specific, I know this isn't anything to do, but I've always wanted to ask you, did you make a specific decision to become a life coach as opposed to, let's say, a therapist? Or I presume with your qualifications, you could have become anything.
Well, when I started going to school at the Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is in Santa Barbara, I was actually living in Mexico, which means that, and the classes there were only once a month, like 3 or 4 day intensive. So I had to like literally travel all the way there, right? And that sort of in part determined whether or not I was going to get a clinical degree or not. So basically I have this nice fancy PhD in psychology, but it's not a clinical degree. So I didn't really learn a lot of the ins and outs of being a therapist. And so, I have a lot of smart things to say about psychology and philosophy, but I don't necessarily have that particular training. So I can't really call myself a therapist. I call myself a life coach. I'm just really upfront with my clients. I'm a life coach. I have a PhD in psychology, so I think I know a lot of things. Yeah. But it gives me also a lot of freedom because, I don't have to affirm, I can And as long as I'm up front, I think I'm, yeah.
I noted that and I thought, isn't that really interesting? And doesn't that give you a lot of freedom? I thought that to myself. And I'm kind of thrilled that it does. I'm thrilled that there's more than one way to be part of a kind of a world where you can provide support to other people. There's more than one way to do it. And I really like the way you come at it.
And just to kind of let our listeners know, Bret is on the Geta website. He's part of the Geta organization. And so we have decided that as long as individuals on Geta list their credentials and are upfront about them, we don't have any particular distinctions between, only people who are licensed therapists can be part of Geta, or only psychologists can be part of Geta. So we really think people in the helping professionals are a broad and diverse group, and we welcome people with a variety of different backgrounds. So, that's really interesting. And it's interesting how that language, just that label, changes what you can and can't do in terms of like that pressure to affirm that all of these licensed therapists feel right now. It's just really interesting.
It's fascinating. And all we're doing is really talking to people. And if you're doing therapy in the right way, and if you're doing life coaching in the right way, you're asking a lot of really open-ended questions. You're reflecting back what you hear, and then you're following up with some more really open-ended questions. I mean, a lot of at the level of technique, it's all very, very similar.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you so much, Bret. We were really glad to have you on. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
This was so much fun. I was nervous before coming on, but it was just like fun.
Oh, don't be.
It was really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. This podcast is sponsored by Rhyme and GenSpect, and listener support means a lot to us. The best way to help is to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Follow us on social media, and if you'd like to become a patron, you'll have access to weekly transcripts of the show, special Q&As, and you can join our listener community. Just go to our Linktree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.